We must build our hard power because that is the currency of the age. We must be able to deter aggression. And yes, if necessary, we must be ready to fight. So said Keir Starmer in his speech to the Munich Security Conference on the 14th of February. A happy Valentine's Day for BAE Systems, perhaps. He was followed the next day by British and German chiefs of defence making the same argument in an editorial in The Guardian. They're not alone in that conviction. Not long after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Olaf Scholz declared the moment a Zeitenwende, a monumental turning point in international affairs. In this reading, which I think also underlay Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's recent speech declaring the end of the liberal world order, Russia's exertion against Europe, the rise of Chinese power, and the instability of the American empire entails the return of a more militarized, conflict-prone, and zero-sum world. Without much in the way of public argument or debate, therefore, political consensus has pretty much determined that Britain and Western nations in general need to rearm and specifically raise their military spending. In Britain's case, Keir Starmer has committed to 2.5% of GDP by 2027 to rise to 3.5% or higher by 2035. It's important to say, I guess, that in cash terms, $81 billion last year, Britain is in fact already the fifth largest military spender globally. So this isn't simply the result of a Trumpian fixation on NATO spending, but a significant shift in foreign policy doctrine and approach, and I think not all of it on American terms. Now, politicians are often deferential to national security and military establishments. In very long historical span, the modern state and its powers of taxation grew up out of foreign policy and out of military concerns, and you'll often hear politicians say, sometimes when they're in a tight spot, that national security is the government's first responsibility. Indeed, that phrase opens last year's national security strategy. But it can leave the ordinary citizen, people like you and me, without the tools to assess the claims made in the name of national security and the demands made by the military establishment. It was, of course, Eisenhower in his farewell address who warned that we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. 65 years later, it isn't obvious that democratic counterweights to that power are at all functional. So, we live in an unsettled time. Just how unsettled and how potentially destructive is it? Is rearmament simply inevitable? How can we assess threats? Is diplomacy simply displacement activity for the deluded? Who stands to benefit from a rearming world, and is Britain risking ending up stranded on its own between the blocks? This is On Politics from the London Review of Books. I am James Butler, and to answer some of my confusion and help me get a grip on the politics of a rearming world, I am joined by Sam Jones, European security correspondent at the Financial Times, and Anna Stavrianakis, Professor of International Relations at the University of Sussex and Director of Research at Shadow World Investigations. Sam, I'm going to come to you first. What do you make of that introduction? And perhaps you can tell us what has changed in the global security picture?
Hi, and thanks for having me. First of all, I mean, an awful lot is the short answer to the last part of your question about what has changed. We're sort of living in an age of huge confusion and change. The last 10 years, actually possibly longer. But if I think back to the world in 2012, how different it was then, and our perceptions of what that meant. That was pre-ISIS, pre the collapse, beginning of the Arab Spring, but pre the invasion of Crimea by Russia. And certainly kind of before a lot of the instability in Asia, the sort of the questions over Taiwan became quite as urgent as they are now. That world seems a very long time ago, and I suppose one thing that I would reflect in response to your introduction is that whilst yes, there is in Europe in particular, in the UK, a huge drive by governments towards increasing military spending. A lot of that is catching up with what I would say is a vastly more insecure global order, and a realization that the kind of the consensus around the kind of world that we are living in, a world of where competition would be mostly through trade, mostly through commerce, mostly through the kind of expansion of globalization around the world. That's over. And maybe you could argue that actually that never went away, that we were living in a kind of post-Cold War delusion. But either way, there's been a kind of wake-up call, I think. The other reflection I would make is that I don't think actually this has been that sudden. So yes, suddenly politicians, you are seeing a lot more of it in the headlines. We've had, Munich this year, Munich last year, and in the year before, a big debate around this. You kind of cited the Zeitenwende idea in Germany. That's been a huge shift in the kind of public political discourse around defense in the space of 2 years. But my reflection would be that actually over the last 10 years there has been a process of change, that whilst the heads of government may only now be really selling this as a big political idea to the public, in actual fact in the security establishment there has been mounting unease, mounting concern, and in the UK's case a long-standing kind of effort by the military and others in the Cabinet Office to get the government to take seriously the threat posed by actors like Russia, China, Iran, but Russia in particular, I would have to say, and to increase military spending as a result. So in a way, I would say that the change for isn't that sudden. I think the change has been underway for quite some time already. It's purely the kind of the effort to sell it to the public, really, that is more recent.
Yeah, I in my notes I have a sort of 2014 Crimea turning point ? Whether that's the sort of watershed moment for me. I mean, Anna, what do you make of that? And if I can ask as well, I mean, I suppose the question that's been on my mind is there's been a lot of emphasis on change. So both Sam and I have talked about a sort of new era here, but I wonder whether you see that there's also some continuity with the sort of the global war on terror and post-global war on terror security architecture.
Absolutely. I think what we're seeing is both an intensification of old patterns and a fragmentation and the creation of new patterns. I think what we're seeing now is a combination of the sort of nakedness of US attempts at domination and its relative decline in relation to countries like China, and then simultaneously the rise of regional powers like Iran, like Russia, who are engaged in their own projects of domination sort of regionally. But yet set against that, we've also got, countries like South Africa taking the Gaza case to the ICJ. We've got the Hague Group committing not to allow the transit of any weapons to Israel. So there's sort of a lot of different moving parts. And I think this question about continuity is really interesting. I teach final year undergraduates about the arms trade, and just the past few weeks we've been looking back at how today's patterns of military spending and arms transfers can be read back not just through the Cold War, which, if we think about the Cold War not just as this East-West confrontation, but as something that's underpinned by a kind of North-South politics of control and domination, we can actually read those histories back not just through the global war on terror, but actually through the Cold War era, through back to tricontinentalism, this historical movement of armed liberation, and back to the period of decolonization, really. I think that's one of the challenges that we have in Britain. And I wonder if it's a sort of particular challenge for the left, and perhaps the white left in Britain, that is trying to marry up these patterns of continuity and change and the interaction between these two things. That on the one hand, yes, it is all about US empire. Whenever I go and speak to a Stop the War meeting or a Palestine Solidarity meeting, it's where there's always a lot of talk about empire and sort of different views about how we should respond to Russia. Yes, I think it's perfectly feasible to talk about US empire, but there are also these other competing regional projects that are in play that are themselves pretty ugly, like what Russia's doing in Ukraine, what Iran is doing to its own people, how the United Arab Emirates is acting as a regional hegemon. So I think it's that combination of I'd say, intensification and fragmentation at the same time.
And if I can ask, I mean, one of the things that's striking to me in the rhetoric around this shift, or the sort of drive to raise military spending, is so the case is made by chiefs of defence staff that the era of the peace dividend is basically over. So there needs to be a rebound. So this is the claim that after the end of the Cold War, because everyone was happy and peaceful now, and there was no really significant war, and we didn't need to do any of that anymore, and we could have nice trade, and we had nice sort of domestic programs. And there's a sort of somewhat rebarbative piece on the LRB blog by Tom Stevenson, just picking some holes in this argument, and it, of course, it points out that actually, if you want to talk of a peace dividend, you probably can do in longer historical span, but that's probably after the end of the Second World War, and he uses some figures from the Stockholm Peace Institute to point out that the historic trend of UK defence spending in GDP terms is simply one of broad decline from about 7% down to about 2.5%. So in the longer term, that's a thing that's been going on for a long time. My question here is about sort of inevitability and the sense of inevitability, right? And there does seem to be this kind of broad political consensus, and I just wonder, on the one hand, it seems to me sometimes particularly progressive opinion of various kinds can be a bit sort of head in the sand about this stuff, not knowing how to articulate criticism of what are very real threats, and we can come on to the question of how we assess threats shortly. But are there other plausible responses, diplomatic, intelligence-led, things like that? Anna, I'll start with you on that question.
I think a helpful place to start would probably be that rearmament, to my mind, is the least plausible response. And I think foregrounding that, given what we know about where military spending actually goes, i.e. the pockets of the shareholders of the arms companies who are increasingly asset management and investment firms, then I think we can start from a slightly different starting place. I think, one of the things that struck me reading Starmer's speech was the utter absence of any actual content. We need to spend more, but on what? What exactly is the nature of the problem? Because there are multiple diagnoses of that problem. I am not sanguine about the problem. I'm not sanguine about it at all. But are you talking about increasing defence spending to spend more money on military procurement when we know that military procurement is increasingly capital intensive, that most of the jobs that people do actually are less kind of traditional engineering and STEM jobs about which we have this kind of nostalgic romance, but are actually in kind of training and sales because that's the nature of the British arms trade now. And so, this question of what is it? Are we spending money on capital-intensive platforms? Are we spending money on soldiers? Are we spending money on recruiting soldiers to train for war? Well, what sort of war are they going to be trained for? The campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan were not that long ago, historically speaking, and we know we've already got evidence that that they weren't really equipped with the right weapons and equipment. There are very serious problems of military procurement, and quite aside from whether you agree or disagree with the task that the soldiers have been sent to do, if you're going to send them, you've got to equip them properly. And to me, it's not simple. There's no simple answer to that.
Yeah, Sam, can I ask, perhaps sort of picking up on that, do you have a sense of how far this stuff is affected by lobbying from it's been noticeable to see that there are comment pieces by CEOs of drone companies, of arms companies, all across the press in the past year and particularly in the past couple of months, making the case for this sort of stuff. So how far is that working behind the scenes? Do you have a sense of that?
Well, whatever I answer, first I'll preface it by saying, please let's remember there is currently a murderous war going on in Ukraine in which tens of thousands of people on both sides are being killed every single month. It is a war that is being solely prosecuted because of Russia. This is not a Ukrainian issue. This is not caused by them. This is not caused by NATO expansion or any of those other ludicrous canards that we hear so much about, particularly on the left, but mostly of which are Kremlin talking points. For good reason. This is a horrible war of aggression. Now, that is happening, and it is happening on Europe's doorstep. I mean, arguably, Ukraine is Europe. There is a reason why politicians are concerned, and so a lot of the dynamics around the whole debate and everything like that, we can talk about the kind of dynamics of the arms industrial complex, and we can quote Eisenhower and so on, but the world is different. It is different to what it was 20 years ago. Now, there was the war on terror, of course, and equally a whole kind of a huge shift occurred after 9/11, and the kind of the dynamics of that are their own thing. I don't see this as quite the same. I don't see this as an extension of the same kind of lobbying interests, if you like. In fact, what I see with a lot of arms companies is that they are struggling to catch up. Now, for sure, they are trying to make as much coin as they can. You look at a company like Rheinmetall in Germany, and you look at the share price of Rheinmetall, which has skyrocketed in the last kind of two years. Rheinmetall is actually struggling to deliver what it can. It's trying to expand into everything, but it's the government that's demanding it. It's not so much the company that is sort of, lobbying intensively the government and saying, we can offer you this, we can offer you that. The Zeitenwende was kind of almost declared before the German arms industry was ready to kind of deliver the goods, so to speak. Now, in some countries like the UK, the arms industry is extremely well networked with the government and with the military. And yes, there is a long-standing issue there, a question around lobbying, but also their kind of, the value for money that they actually deliver. There's a history of kind of projects that come in vastly over expense, and there's an ongoing kind of procurement nightmare that the government in the UK seems to have. I mean, actually, I would say, possibly this is, in contrast to Anna's point, the issue is not enough arms sales as a result of that. One of the problems is that for the UK, they tend to order bespoke products from BAE Systems. And then BAE Systems can't sell those to other people because the UK government says, no, we want to keep this sensitive tech for ourselves. And so they actually have relatively smaller profit margins on the individual things, like, for example, the aircraft carriers. They've only made 2 of them, and no one else is going to buy that anywhere in the world, and same with some of their other naval projects in recent years. So they kind of have an issue in terms of, one of the problems is that it's an economically inefficient system, the UK arms industry. And so they overcharge in order to maximize profits. And the government really is, it's kind of over a barrel because they've got no other suppliers to turn to. I mean, that's a problem that you find elsewhere in Europe as well. The arms industry works best at scale, and unfortunately for all of us. But as a result, you have, in Europe, you have lots of different arms companies that continue to squabble. And this is one of the big problems in Europe now in terms of, how they spend the money that governments are allocating to them. They're inevitably going to spend it very inefficiently because Germany is doing its own drone project. France is doing its. They can't agree. I mean, there's a thing called the Future Combat Air System that the French and the Germans have been squabbling over for 5 years now, or longer, in fact, and which is almost certainly going to fall apart with nothing being produced, and hundreds of millions has been spent on that already. So, yes, a huge amount of money is sunk into the arms industry and ends up in the hands of shareholders. That for me is an efficiency problem. With the industry and with where taxpayers' money goes, which is separate to the need to spend that money in the first place, because I fail to see how, given what's going on in the world, in particular in Europe, it could possibly be justified that Germany, the largest economy in Europe, could continue to spend, 1.5%, 1.2% of its GDP on defense, as was the case for many, many years.
If I could just come in on this, the lobbying issue that you started with, James. I think I have an ambivalence about these arguments about the impact of lobbying, because on the one hand, it's very easy to see that it's an accurate description. Obviously, there is this thing called the arms lobby. We know how the revolving door that people go through from industry into government. We know the number of meetings and the ways in which the arms industry is privileged over other industries. But I think it's a mistake to conflate a description with an explanation, because what that description does is it puts the blame on the excessive influence of industry. and obscures the state's own interest in maintaining military power and military might. So if you read the work of someone like David Wearing, my colleague here at Sussex, who's worked on this, he says it's not just about the corporate profit of the arms companies, it's also about the desire of the British state to exercise this kind of geostrategic power. And so I think one of the things that we struggle with in this country is exactly what Sam has pointed to, which is sort of this question of the need to spend the money in the first place. One of the key features of British foreign relations historically is that it's been about power projection rather than defence, let alone of homeland defence. So at the moment, this word defence is being bandied around, and it has a very strong symbolic and rhetorical value, which is exactly why people use it, but it's utterly devoid of content, which is not to say that there isn't a really important question about how to respond to Russian aggression against Ukraine. So what I'm really not seeing is this question of where is the sustained, deep, strategic political analysis of what Russia actually wants and what it wants in relation to what Western powers are doing. So I find it kind of frustrating when we get stuck in this binary between, on the left, well, it was NATO expansion, what done it? Versus on the other side, no, it was just Russian expansionism, what done it? I don't think they're equal. I don't think they're equally weighted arguments. I happen personally to think that Russia's aggression is the primary cause of the war in Ukraine. But you also cannot understand it in isolation from what has happened before. We also know that in a lot of the planning about trying to warn Ukraine about the impending Russian invasion, a lot of that was really stymied and hampered by other countries' skepticism based on being misled by the US over the war in Iraq and the WMD claim. Those things have long histories, and so we are reaping what we sowed. And so I think that one of the things that just disappoints me and frustrates me about, as being someone who works in this area, both in a university, but also trying to engage with policymakers and journalists and the public, is that we have a really, and I blame politicians, I blame corporate leaders, and I blame mainstream media. We have a really poor public level of understanding of some of the nuance of these issues. And I think people are not stupid. I think we are owed it as a public to have a meaningful conversation about this.
The LRB podcast wouldn't exist without the London Review of Books, Europe's leading magazine of culture and ideas. With a subscription, you not only get the latest issue of the paper, you also get access to everything we've published over more than 40 years in our online archive. So if you enjoy the podcast, why not try 6 months of the magazine for just £12? Go to lrb.me/pod and we'll also send you a free LRB tote bag. That's lrb.me/pod, or find the link in the description.
Can I pick up that the thread of this conversation and ask a question? It's a question that grows out of thinking about the coverage of Russian aggression in the press, especially over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. It's one of those stories where there are many known unknowns. There are things that are hard to assess about Russian military strength, and there are things that we rely on inference for. So, for instance, whether the sort of range of sort of Russian probing of European and Western defense, so these sort of relatively low-level attacks which seem to sort of probe for weaknesses, should tell us something about whether that's an act of desperation or merely something that is, something that is standard operating procedure for, for a country with Russia's posture. Domestically, it seems to me that it's quite, that I don't have the information or the critical resources to make distinctions between accurate assessments of threats and inflated assessments of threats. And, threat inflation is something that we know happens. I think it's sometimes excessively applied to Russia. So I think early in the war there was a very some sort of rather excitable idea that the Russian military was going to collapse immediately, and actually it was all a sort of a Potemkin army. That's not true, although it's an extremely brutal conflict, as Sam, you pointed out. So I guess my question is how, as a citizen, as someone who thinks about where and how I should vote and who has interest in what my country does and where it spends its money, how am I able to distinguish between reports on threats that are accurate, that should be taken really, really seriously, reports that are alarmist and or rely on sort of simple declarations of authority, and those that might be in one way or another motivated by self-interest or agency interest or kind of corporate blinkers. And by corporate there, I don't just mean private corporations, I mean agencies of various kinds, because of course there are incentives here. I guess one of the reasons this is on my mind is I was reading a piece by Ben Judah, who used to be the advisor to David Lammy, on the Chagos Islands deal. And lots of the article depended on a sort of claim from authority, which I understand has to happen occasionally in foreign policy situations. So if you knew the things this was used for, you would accept this deal wholeheartedly. But that seems to me to be a very unsatisfying way of approaching these things. Sam, what do you think?
I think, one thing that always strikes me as curious is that people, not just now, but forever, talk about Russia as being this kind of enigmatic great power that we never know what they're going to do. I mean, the whole Churchill thing, about Matryoshka dolls, or the metaphor. Not the case at all. There is, years and decades of academic study, of kind of historical study, of political analysis on Russia and its kind of geopolitical aims. I mean, I think Putin is. There's a debate around how much he's kind of cosplaying being a czar, but I do think certain things move in patterns and channels over the long durée, and I think that Putin very much sees himself as an imperial figure. I'm not sure he'd use that language, but in terms of what he is seeking to do, and I would particularly I often find it on the left. I wonder why they struggle with this categorization of what the Putin project is, because to me it is manifestly a form of fascism. And at least some kind of extreme authoritarianism. And by the way, there is a lot of academic literature on fascist regimes and how they behave in foreign policy terms. So and how those kind of and the kind of models that can help us understand this. So I do firstly think that Russia is not hard to understand if we just take Russia. And I know your question was broader, James, but just to take the Russian threat, to Europe. It is easier to understand. It is for me pretty easy to understand. And in terms of how you counter it, I also think that there is a lot of literature around that, which isn't just the kind of the knee-jerk government sources say ... according to an official security figure, this, that, or the other. And I think that actually, Anna is completely right. One of the massive problems the West faces is the kind of confidence deficit in those security figures because of what's happened in the last 20 years in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world. But particularly of, just looking at the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, which came before it. But I think Iraq being the really big one that, with the weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. That is an this is a sort of salutary lesson in what happens if you undermine public trust in your foreign policy objectives, or in these anonymous figures and their ability to claim things. We are absolutely kind of reaping the whirlwind of that, and in Europe, I think it was the same thing. I mean, a final point. I do think it's interesting to compare the debate in the UK versus the debate in a lot of European countries, and in particular in Germany, where I think until 2022, there was deep skepticism in Germany, all the way up the political establishment and the public at large, to this idea that Russia was a threat, certainly to the idea that, even after the invasion of Crimea, that US warnings about Putin's malign intentions and so on should be taken seriously, and the same in France. Actually, I mean, so much so in Germany, by the way, that the head of the BND, the German intelligence service, was in Kiev on the day the invasion began. and then spent, like 12 hours in a traffic jam trying to leave the city. So they really did not believe at all the US or the UK, who were saying publicly at that point, which was pretty unprecedented, that the Russians were about to invade, and I think that absolutely speaks to the complete lack of confidence and the complete lack of kind of faith in the intelligence being supplied by the Five Eyes. That's changed because obviously then the invasion did happen, and I think that's what the Zeitenwende refers to. It was a wake-up call. It was a shock to a lot of Europeans. There's a double whammy. There's a sting in the tail because the shock, the kind of the aftershock, if you like, or the follow-on shock was the Donald Trump presidency, and coming the second term. And now finding actually that the US, who previously had been a kind of staunch supporter of Ukraine, had been really pushing the Europeans to do something with Ukraine, is now the opposite, is now actually not only kind of very interested in making some kind of peace deal with Putin, but also in many ways you could argue sees Europe as its number one target, as a geopolitical threat or something it needs to destabilize, rather than China or Russia.
Anna.
I think Sam raises a really interesting issue when he says that there's lots of academic scholarship to help us and to help government understand Russia and to understand other challenges. I think that speaks to the relationship between politics and scholarship, and the sort of the need for translation between the two, that actually it's quite hard to translate the lessons of scholarship into policy imperatives. But what we also see is the absolute hollowing out of the British civil service and the politicisation of it. Like more than once, I've been to meetings where I've literally had civil society research quoted back at me as government research, and that's simply because there isn't capacity. So I think there's a very serious political problem around resourcing the necessary translation between scholarship and politics. And then the other thing I'd say is, in terms of reasons to be wary and histories of threat inflation, if you're anybody who has been involved with or paid attention to anti-militarist social movements, climate justice movements, anti-racist movements, you will likely have been infiltrated by the intelligence services, right? The Spy Cops inquiry, men have had children under completely false pretenses. It is a totally justified fear that people have of the intelligence services, and as a long-term observer of the arms trade, and I've seen not sure how many, but several judicial reviews of UK arms export policy. The thinness of, the legal arguments are very clever. So James Eadie does a very good job every time. The substance in terms of knowledge of the arms trade and how it operates is always really thin. And then what happens is you have a portion of the hearings are heard in open court, but then they retire to secret, closed proceedings. And so what we had with the judicial review of arms exports to Israel, for example, was these claims from the UK government that suspending even parts for the F-35 to Israel would undermine peace and security, and then they just put in code word NATO, Ukraine, and that had to suffice. We were supposed to accept that with exactly the claim that, well, don't worry, there's nothing to see here, we know better than you, but we also know that governments lie. And governments lie repeatedly. So I'm sorry, why should we accept what they say in secret as being legitimate? I think that for me, the political question of legitimacy and of democratic deficit is actually the major problem here, which is kind of separate from the question of what can we know, what can we not know, what can the scholarship tell us?
It is, but I would say, we don't know. Oh, sorry, James. I was just going to say in response to Anna's point that, we didn't know before the invasion of Ukraine began. We had the US and the UK and others saying this is going to happen, there's going to be a war. But now it has happened. Now there is a war, and there is, it's a war that's going badly for Russia and going badly for Ukraine. But remarkably better for Ukraine than anyone anticipated. But, Russia is still producing, shell production in Russia has increased by, is increased exponentially. I mean, they're produced 7 million shells last year, or rounds of explosive ammunition for mortars and so on, and shells for guns. That's up from something like 4 million in 2024. So, huge increases in military production. They are importing shells from North Korea. They're stockpiling weapons. Now, do I believe that Russia wants to invade a NATO state and therefore there's going to be World War III? No. But of course, lots of wars happen because of miscalculations on both sides. But do we know that the Russians are militarizing, at an alarming rate? Yes. Are they fighting a war of aggression and expansion? Yes. Is there, of course, then, do we need to? Does that mean that we should trust everything our intelligence services and throw all of our legal checks and balances out of the window in the West? No, of course not. But there is a way of kind of squaring that picture. We do know what Russia is doing. We do have to respond. The trick is kind of doing so in a way that's proportional. And not undermining the very things I know this is a bit of a kind of a hackneyed idea, but that we shouldn't be undermining. We shouldn't be becoming the enemy the monster we seek to defeat. We do want to preserve our own liberties and protections and so on. So should we be on a war footing? No, obviously not. And no one's asking for that or saying that. Should military spending go up? Yeah, I think it has to. Because that's what Russia takes seriously. I think, the Estonian intelligence service, who obviously feel very much on the front line of this, and the Estonian government would say, look, the only thing that Russia listens to is, and I cite them because they came out with a large report last week on the strategic situation facing that country. They would say, well, the only thing Russia listens to is on Keir Starmer's point, is the kind of show of force. The currency of the age is the show of military force. Now, of course, there's a debate around how much money or how much we spend on that, what that looks like for society. But I don't think, we're not talking. Russia is spending 7% of its GDP on the military. The UK currently 2.5%. Something like that, right? So, and others, I mean, the US is somewhere between 3 and 4, but even at the height of the war on terror, I think was only about 4%. 5% of Russians work in the arms industry. It's now that they are turning into a war economy. That is happening in Russia. Do we have to do the same, or is this a kind of they did this, we did that? Absolutely not. But we can't ignore what's happening right there. And we can't ignore what China's doing, and we can't ignore, those kind of things. So, interesting thing, just one last point on the kind of Trump thing. In the US, who knows what's going to happen there? Because he, of course, started out, and the MAGA movement is now splitting because, of this idea that, he's kind of discovering the joy as a president under threat domestically of dramatic foreign policy interventions. Whereas a lot of the MAGA movement, they wanted no more foreign wars. They wanted a pullback of the defense spending and so on. And that's, Marjorie Taylor Greene very much in that mold. So who knows what's going to happen after the midterms. But, as a European, I feel that, separate to what the US is doing, that the actual real world environment justifies a higher spend on defense. And we can do that. Let's not get carried away without, saying we need to militarize now and conscription needs to happen and so on, as some are calling for.
But that's so interesting, Sam. I suppose that the nub of it is this question of how to respond, right? I absolutely agree with you. Like, Russia has transitioned to a fully blown war economy. Like, I don't disagree with you about that at all. I think the bit where I get stuck is where on the one hand, we're like, yeah, we need to spend more, but should we move to a war footing? No. Right. So what should we be spending more on? Because the question that comes to me is also, let's think not just in relation to Russia. Let's think about British foreign relations more generally. Let's also not forget that Britain has materially supported a genocide in Gaza and the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition war on Yemen, both in the last decade, both of which have caused what were at the time called the world's worst humanitarian disasters, right? Ukraine does not have a monopoly on suffering. There are many vicious wars, and that's, before we even talk about Sudan, but even before we even talk about what's happening in Ethiopia and Tigray and all these other wars that we don't, hear about or publicly care about. I think the rationale, what I think needs to be more clearly articulated by our political leaders as a matter of democratic good governance and basic decency towards not only us as taxpayers who are paying for it, but also Ukrainians and Yemenis and Palestinians and other people who are on the receiving end of the horrific wars that are happening, is the political assessment of the threat or risk posed by Russia. In what way exactly? We know, stuff like the Novichok poisonings. We know, like, the testing of the boundaries of NATO airspace, the messing around with, cables. And, like, there are a multiplicity of forms of testing that oftentimes, are strategies short of war, tactics short of war, testing the boundaries of all of that. The question of what to do and how to respond is a deeply political one that has to be put to the public for public consideration and public debate, because it's our money that is going to pay for it. I can't help but feel that at the moment, for this Labour government that has moved so far to the right, because that's its strategic decision on how to engage politically with the Tories and with the rise of reform, they've moved so far to the right that they've forgotten that there's any need to actually engage people on these questions. And unfortunately, it's that I think, a significant part of what's happening now is the good old-fashioned distract them with a foreign war, which is not to say that Russia isn't an aggressive imperialist power that invaded its neighbour. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And I think we are owed it by our political leaders to be able to handle complexity.
If I can ask a question that is in some ways all about complexity, in fact. Thinking about this ahead of this conversation, I really struggled with trying to get a handle on what war looks like for a developed Western nation today, because it's not going to be digging the trenches, and it's not going to be, sort of World War II style conflict. There has been for many years the suggestion that Europe needs to better coordinate its both its defence policy, but also perhaps its armies into a single security force. That doesn't seem to me like it will ever actually happen. I mean, it's such a perennial hope and dream of European federalists, but it seems to me that the political dynamics in Europe are pulling sort of contrariwise to that. But at the same time, there does seem to be this sort of greater spirit of cooperation, the sort of Franco-German possibility of a sort of nuclear tie-up. That looks like that's likely, and that might change lots of calculations on the board. The other side of this is intelligence, and intelligence, I think, has loomed over lots of our conversation today. And of course, it's in some ways the blackest of the black boxes when we talk about it in terms of sort of public consent or political debate. And Sam, I know you've reported on a number of misdeeds of various intelligence services around the world. I wonder if you have a sense of where sort of political consent lies in Britain, especially, because we look at the press now, and there's been, I think, over the last year or so, a kind of concerted push to underscore the importance of intelligence in the sort of contemporary order, as well as sort of humanize, I think, the incoming or the current head of Blaise Metroelli, who has given any number of profiles. It's always seemed to me that she's slightly uncomfortable with it. But this push to kind of both humanize and stress the importance of intelligence in the current global order. At the same time, there's been the longer term picture here is one in which the post-Snowden revelations about what GCHQ sort of gets up to in terms of signals analysis, it's never seemed to me that there's been much kind of political consequence for the services in that way. What's your sense of where the British public and perhaps European publics in general are in relation to that specific side of war?
It's a good question. I mean, I suppose the fascinating thing coming from I formerly reported on UK intelligence services and was based in the UK, and seeing them from Europe, you realise how reverentially the UK state treats its intelligence agencies, and how they really are kind of not just actually the state, to be frank, but society at large kind of has this somewhat romanticised image about intelligence and their work. And evidently they trade on that. With it's not for nothing that Vauxhall invites the headquarters of MI6 invites has private screenings of the latest James Bond movies, and invites all of the kind of the production cast and everything in to see it with C, and so on and so forth. And actually it was Blaze's predecessor, Richard Moore, who really kind of was the one that I think under him they first opened their first Twitter account and so on, Instagram account, and they trade on that. And that's fair enough. I mean, they are, it's their job to kind of, create mystique and employ. And by the way, that's a huge part of what a successful intelligence agency does, because you want to draw people to you ultimately, in the UK to recruit for your workforce, but also internationally. You need to create a mystique that allows people to kind of make the leap of faith that ultimately is going to get them to turn on their countries of birth or against the governments they work for. So mystique is part of the game. The interesting thing politically, I think, is why in the UK we have such a weak system of oversight for those agencies. In Germany at the moment they are debating and they will introduce probably later this year a law to give the BND, which is Germany's equivalent of MI6, significant new powers. But alongside that will come a whole raft of kind of legal checks and balances. I mean, they're basically almost talking about creating a kind of parallel judicial agency whose sole job it will be to oversee the intelligence agencies. And there is an extensive debate about, okay, well, what happens with that agency? And right now in Germany, which the system that they want to change, Parliament basically has independent oversight of the work of the BND, and all of its kind of warrants and stuff like that are reviewed by a committee of parliamentarians, which is not controlled by the government and has, its own legal kind of force of, it's a separate entity. And although obviously there are members of the CDU, the current, the party of the Chancellor, in there at the moment, it's a body independent of the government and of the Chancellery and of all the ministries. It reports only to Parliament. I mean, it's like the ISC in the UK, the Intelligence and Security Committee, but with actual power and with actual responsibility. They review all the warrants. They have total access, and they themselves can decide to declassify information with the 2/3 majority of the committee. So, it really has quite significant oversight. The current debate is, maybe it's not an efficient system. Fair enough. Either way, there is a deep public debate in Germany around appropriate oversight. That doesn't exist at all in the UK. We have this kind of committee of old men, basically, who are all ex-parliamentarians or ex-ministers, because they're the only ones deemed to have the kind of background and heft relevant enough to scrutinise the intelligence services. Now, in fairness to the intelligence services, I also, know that a lot of what they do, I mean, they employ hundreds and hundreds of lawyers, and I suspect Anna and I might have different perspectives on what the work those lawyers do is. But they are kind of, they're not. I wouldn't say they're not trying to get away with everything they can. They are very mindful of their legal constraints. Now, will they find ways to overstep, or have they found ways to overstep them in the past? Yes, evidently. I mean, all of the cases that have come to light, particularly with regard to domestic surveillance in the UK. And the powers of the police, yes, that's the case. Is that also because of terrible legislation? Probably. I mean, a lot of the legislation that's been put in that these agencies are governed by has been, rushed through on the pretext of again, to our previous point, under the context of the war on terror, without proper kind of sense of like, how long is this going to last? What relevance does this have for this situation, that situation? The extensive surveillance powers that all kinds of bodies in the British state have is alarming compared to most other states. That clearly intelligence plays a huge role. I'll just finish by saying, in the Ukraine, the entire reason I would suppose that the Ukraine has been holding off against vastly, more Russian soldiers for so long is because of intelligence largely supplied by the US and the UK.
Just to add to what Sam has been saying, I think you're absolutely right about this problem of the absence of oversight. And the example that springs to mind is the RAF surveillance flights from RAF Akrotiri heading towards Gaza, that when journalists from Declassified started to report on it, not only were they blocked, but the MOD also banned MPs from asking about it in Parliament. I mean, if that doesn't signal a democratic deficit, I don't know what does.
If I can sort of pick up on that and ask, I mean, this is, it's funny that the domestic conversation here is often predicated on this sort of assumption that sort of the British military has been hollowed out in one way or another, and what you've both pointed out there is actually it's pretty integrated and pretty essential to various bits of the world system. Whether we approve of them, as in the case of the supply of intelligence to Ukraine, or we're critical of them in the case, certainly for me, of the flights over Gaza. And I think there are really significant questions to still be asked there. So it seems to me that the picture is a little more complicated, in fact, than lots of parties tend to make out about the state of the British Armed Forces. At the same time, of course, the state of British military procurement is baffling in some ways. The tank that deafens you being only the sort of latest in a long line of procurement disasters. That was a tremendously expensive project that has turned into a bit of a nightmare. I guess I have a question about British futures in general, and one of the things that's been on my mind, when thinking about this, has been what is in some ways the sort of classic Churchillian vision of the position of Britain in the global system, which is that it mediates three kind of structures of international relationship, right? One is with the United States, so that's the transatlantic one. One is with Europe, so it's a sort of pivot point between Europe and the United States in particular. Something Charles de Gaulle was cognizant of and hostile to. And of course, it's influenced globally through the Commonwealth. And, in each of those relationships has become rather more troubled over the course of the past decade and a half. Obviously, the US has sort of set fire to itself politically. The Commonwealth seems to be going its separate ways. And we decided to cut ourselves off rather catastrophically from Europe. So that isn't looking great. And so the obvious question that arises for me is, what does the future for Britain look like in a global order, particularly vis-a-vis security and defence, in which those relationships are now much more in question than they have been, I think, for the last half century? Sam?
I mean, I think at the nub of your question, as you highlighted, just think about where those three areas of British interest are, spanning the globe kind of thing. And, we are not an imperial power anymore. And, I feel a lot of the kind of UK military problem, strategic problem, if you like, or rather, let me walk that back a step. The problem for me, a lot of the problem stems from a kind of poor strategy. Is, what are we seeking to achieve here? And no one is really articulating it in clear terms, other than with these kind of rather whimsical appeals to kind of imperial power and the projection of power. And in a way, our relationship with the US allows us to continue to do that, because it's sort of allowed us to, be part of the, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. I look at something like the commissioning of the 2 aircraft carriers, vastly expensive projects, which that was I believe it was the NATO summit in Wales more than a decade ago, at which it was announced that those were going ahead, or rather it might have been the second of those we decided to do. That's a sort of and the whole idea around getting those was literally a kind of east of Suez notion of that Britain will once again be able to play a role in the South China Seas, which for me is crazy. I mean, obviously we have a very close intelligence and defensive partner in Australia, and clearly the US has huge interests there. But was that the best use of Britain's kind of strategic assets to kind of think about how we can project them all the way against China? And the government still, loves, and you can follow the Navy's account on Twitter or whatever. They love putting pictures up of a kind of, whichever of their kind of vessels or the aircraft carriers in Hong Kong. I mean, not anymore in Hong Kong, but in the Philippines or wherever. But really, I think we as a power can't do that and also talk about how to deter Russia, and also worry about, drone technology, and also worry about, what's going on in the Middle East and the Mediterranean and so on and so forth, and talk about having a credible nuclear deterrent. So I think one of the problems is that our strategy is far too all-encompassing, and there is not a grown-up debate in UK politics about what a more limited version of UK power would look like. What one helpful thing, and I think in fairness, the military chiefs are more than aware of this, and when politicians stand up and say we need more money, they've got the argument the wrong way around. It's because the military chiefs are saying to the politicians are saying we want to do all of this, and the military chiefs are saying, well, that's not possible unless you give us more money. I don't think the military chiefs are actually saying, we want more money in order to be able to send a flotilla to Indonesia or wherever. I think, that they're actually waiting for some guidance and instructions, and all they get from Downing Street and everyone else is this kind of generic sense in which Britain must be still must be a kind of, they talk about sort of full spectrum military power, which is impossible. We're not we can't be a full spectrum military power. What we could be is a much more effective partner in NATO, where we have a sensible discussion with the French and with the Germans in particular about, what can you do, what can we do? Unfortunately, as you point out, James, Brexit has rather exploded that, and now, of course, the problem with the US. So, I think so many of our problems with defense spending and the wastefulness of it are because of this failure of strategic direction and thinking. And again, back to Anna's point, public debate. There's no one saying to the public, this money is going to go on this and this and this, and that's what we need it for. And I think that's a huge problem ultimately long term in terms of justifying it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think I find it very difficult to have anything coherent to say, I think, on this, because of the gap between what we might sort of ideally or politically wish for versus the strategic possibilities, given the utter paucity of political imagination from our leaders. I find that quite striking. For me, there's a real dissonance there when I'm asked that sort of question between what I say the UK state could do. I mean, there's all sorts of things the UK state could do. It could just not support a genocidal war in Gaza. It could just not have kept selling weapons to Saudi Arabia while it continued to violate international law in Yemen. It could just have done those things. And I think the thing that always gets me with this is, frankly, is when they blether on about values and the rule of law, British values. It's all in Keir Starmer's speech. I'm like, sorry, Keir, what are British values? Because it's not, you say it as if it's obvious that Britain stands for good governance, rule of law, smooth running of institutions. I don't know, go tell that to the people of Gaza. Go tell that to the people of Yemen. Tell that to the racialised minorities in Britain who are on the receiving end, of some of the worst forms of austerity. And that's where I think defence spending actually really matters domestically. It might not resonate with people as something that's an everyday concern for them. But you know what is an everyday concern for them? The cost of living crisis, austerity, inflation, being able to pay their rent or mortgage, being able to get their kid access to a school, let alone if they've got SEND needs, being able to get an appointment with the doctor, let alone follow up with a consultant. Those things are directly related to the active choices made by government about what to spend money on. And so I think, we on the left could do a lot more to draw those connections between what's happening domestically and what's happening abroad. And if we are going to talk about what's happening abroad, I think one of the things that I'm really struck by when I talk to soldiers or former soldiers who served in Iraq and Afghanistan is the way in which, when they talk about the sort of kit or equipment that they did or didn't have, why didn't they have camouflage boots? Why were they sent out to Iraq and Afghanistan with black boots rather than camouflage boots? Why did their boots melt? Why do soldiers go to second-hand military kit shops to supplement the stuff that's issued to them? This is if there's a social contract with the soldiers, like, give the guys and girls a chance, right? Equip them properly. And the other thing that strikes me is that a lot of there's a real sort of historical and political dissonance between the weapons and equipment that they've got versus the actual types of war that they're fighting. So they're in tanks, so some of the things about military procurement are truisms, right? Really long lead-in times, really complicated kit. They're big projects. I don't dispute any of that. But what that means is that you've got soldiers who are riding around in vehicles that were designed for combat on the Eastern European plains, but they're then having to go and fight counterinsurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan. But now they're equipped with these Land Rovers, and this question about how we arm and protect the Land Rovers. But then, oh no, now are we going to be sending them back out to Ukraine to fight the other type of war? Well, make your mind, if you're a politician and you're going to send the soldiers to war, you've got to equip them properly. So decide which kind of war you want to fight, which is why I go back to this question about thinking about defence rather than about power projection.
I have maybe a final question very quickly for both of you. If I were to ask you sort of to project yourself, as we started to, at the start of this conversation, we said, things look very different to how they looked 10 years ago. I wonder what the Sam and Anna of 2036, looking back on the decade that's passed, thinks, well, there's the thing that I was wondering how it would turn out, or what the known unknowns might be over the course of that decade which is to come. Anna, I'm going to start with you.
I would say the power of grassroots social movement organising. One of the things that we really don't hear enough about is the actual lived experiences of people like the Filton 24, who've now pretty much all been released. Many of them have been acquitted. Watching some of the video footage of them leaving prison, where they've been held on remand. They haven't been tried yet. 4 of them went on hunger strike. They were prepared to die. And the British state was absolutely going to let them die. Seeing the video footage of them coming out of prison was really, really moving. And I think that actually when we talk about politics, we like to focus on the politicians and the companies and the elites. And we have a very sort of formal, official view of politics. And we can disagree about, whether it's corporate influence or politician malfeasance or whatever. But in all of that, we're not paying attention to the grassroots activists. We're not paying attention to the ordinary people who are engaging in, really life-changing activism to intervene in the circuits of war preparation, to intervene to protect the climate, to challenge militarism, to demand a more just future. And that's the thing that I really hope we'll be paying attention to more.
Sam, 2036 Sam, what does he look back and see?
Part of 2036 Sam hopes he'll still be alive because there hasn't been some kind of disastrous war in Europe. I do say that, partly, I do say that seriously, actually. I think I don't want to be alarmist, but I don't think wars begin always deliberately in a kind of, thought out way. I mean, they certainly never necessarily begin. They certainly never necessarily achieve what they set out to, but I also think we're living in an age of such rapid technological change and political instability whilst also being an age of wars and huge military spending, that I do worry about what might end up happening. I hope that as a result, my focus is in Europe. That's so I can't speak to elsewhere in the world. I don't know about the situation in China with any authority, but in Europe at least, I do hope that Russia's aggression in Ukraine is checked, and I hope this war ends terribly for them, for Putin. I mean, not the Russian people. I hope some kind of peace is achieved there, and it's still holding in 2036. And there is still an independent Ukraine.
That is a wish I think we all share. And that's a good place for us to end it. Sam and Anna, thank you for a completely fascinating and enlightening conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you're listening and enjoying, you can do me a favour and head on to wherever you're listening from and rate this podcast 5 stars. And even better, if you go out and share it on social media. And of course, if you're enjoying this, you know that you should be reading the London Review of Books in the new issue. Jackson Lears on Zbigniew Brzezinski, Titan of the Cold War. Barbara Newman on the origin myths of England and Ireland. Erin McGluckie considers Caravaggio. And one James Butler, that would be me, on the fall of Peter Mandelson.